Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started here. This is open to the public, open to all the members, and if you'll just allow maybe the last two rows for those of you that are not members to allow our members to, for the Ways and Means, Economic Development, Small Business Development, and anyone else that's a member of the House to come join us. This is unusual. We have three large committees. And we're also, just for your information, we're being streamed live to the class of in Georgia Tech, which is also unusual to for this particular meeting. Typically, whenever we see economic development legislation, especially tax, in a tax nature, the only thing that we see is a fiscal note, and there's a lot more to the question. And Chairman Knight, I'll turn it over to you if you wanted to say anything about your committee or any comments. Chairman Chanel. Wanted to introduce, and we'll just dive right into it, Christine Rice from Georgia Tech. She has a class that she teaches a long time. If you'll join us up here, Christine. She's brought some of her students, which has done an in-depth study of the Pratt Whitney expansion in Columbus, and I think we might even have some members in that area. But Christine, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you all for coming, and to start by saying I'm just tremendously proud of these two Georgia Tech students. But to give you some background, the Georgia Tech School of Economics had determined that for a capstone course, we wanted to put in a project-based learning that would both take our students and consolidate the learning that they've done in economics in 4 years. So this is a requirement for their graduation from Georgia Tech with a degree in economics. So consolidate their learning, put them in a position where they're better able to use that learning to operate effectively and professionally right away. And we use the opportunity to do something I think very special for the state of Georgia. We've run this capstone course for a couple of semesters now, and we have groups of between 2, 3, and 4 students who identify a company that has moved into Georgia sometime within the last 2 or 3 years. They take the semester and study that company in depth. They study the investment in depth and the economics in depth. And then they study the state economy in depth. And finally, they put this through a package and they put it all together. So again, they are looking at the impact of these investments on the state economy of Georgia. And this particular group did a really incredible job on their project about the Pratt & Whitney expansion. And they really dug into the intricacies of the situation and have shown that it's really important when you use some of these models to go into a little bit more depth. And not surprisingly, you've really got to know about the specifics of the company, the specifics of the situation. You can't just run numbers through a model. And I know that you will all find what they have to talk about really helpful. We've left time for questions and answers at the end. So I'd like to introduce to you Chris Taylor and Mark Williams. Chris also is getting his double majoring in economics and industrial and systems engineering, and he will graduate in May. And Mark graduated in December. So welcome.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Taylor, as Dr. Reese mentioned. First of all, thank you for having us here today. This is quite an honor to have a project that we put a lot of work in to come to something and hopefully be of some kind of use to you. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I came to Georgia Tech in 2008. I started out as a mechanical engineer and actually had the opportunity to work with Delta Airlines kind of in this industry at their technical operations center. So to be able to take that real experience and apply it on a project like this has been fantastic. I'm now a economics and industrial engineering double major, as Dr. Reese mentioned. So my focus is more on strategy and operations now, but it's been quite an experience to delve into this kind of detail on a single investment, the Columbus expansion, and be able to see the big picture, how economics, finance, and industrial engineering all come into play. So thanks for having us. I appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Mark Williams. As Dr. Reese said, I just graduated with a degree in economics. I actually started out as an aerospace engineer at Georgia Tech, but decided I liked money better. I decided we picked Pratt & Whitney aerospace company, so it kind of all ties in together. I guess we'll go ahead and...
So our purpose here today, what we're going to do is walk you through a model that we ran to analyze the impact that Pratt & Whitney's investment to expand their Columbus, Georgia facility has made on the Georgia economy. And as we do that, hopefully we'll illustrate to you some of the intricacies involved in economic impact analysis modeling in general. So I'm sure that since economic impact analysis isn't a term that's thrown around very often, you're probably wondering, why does this affect me? You know, where will I see this? Where do I come across this kind of information? Well, in just 2011, AJC published this article in the paper. It pertains to Caterpillar's investment in opening a new manufacturing facility here in Georgia. The article tells you that the investment cost the company $200 million to get the facility up and running. And it goes on to claim that the total economic impact of the state of Georgia would be $1.4 billion, including $33 million in tax revenue for the government. It also says that the new plant would employ 1,400 people. This means 1,400 new jobs coming to the state. A similar article was published a year earlier, talking about the tech giant NCR, their decision to relocate their headquarters to Georgia. Because of the benefits that would be brought to the state, including the creation of 3,000 jobs over 5 years, the government decided to offer the company $100 million in incentives to locate to Georgia instead of another state. So these are kind of some typical examples of how economic impact analysis is used in everyday life. You'll see these examples frequently in the newspaper anytime there's any kind of business change or any kind of investment, and the idea is to tell you exactly how the investment is going to impact you and how it will impact your constituency or the region that you're representing. So how do these models work? Every economic impact analysis begins with some sort of investment, whether this is opening a new manufacturing site, bringing a new service center to the region, opening a new headquarters, or any kind of other new business that will bring jobs and money and stuff to the region. So for the purposes of illustration, let's pretend that we're investing $100 in a lemonade stand. The model would start by analyzing what's called the direct effect. What this means is it would trace that $100 as you spent it. Let's say, for example, you spent $60 on capital. What that would mean is maybe you spend $20 to buy the stand itself, $20 on maybe cups and pitchers, and $20 to buy the lemonade powder. The model would account for those as it starts to compute the total impact that you would have on the economy. On the other side of the direct effect is your labor expenditure. For example, you might have to hire someone to advertise your business, someone to make the lemonade, and someone to handle the cash register. However, the model doesn't stop there. Many times you'll see just the investment figures published in the paper, but that's not really what we're interested in. The model continues to account for the indirect effect. What this is tracing the money that you gave to your suppliers and seeing how they spend it. For example, the person supplying you a stand would have to buy lumber and pay eventually for the chemical treatments that treat the wood or the nails that put it together. The lemonade supplier would have to pay for the sugar and the flavoring that goes into their product. So the model accounts for all of these changes as that money, as we say, ripples throughout the economy. And then a similar ideology is applied on the labor side. This is measured in what's called the induced effect. Basically, as you pay your laborers wages, they have to go out and they spend that money on the goods and services they need. So these models, using real-world transaction data, would trace exactly how each type of person would spend their money. They know that they need to get food either from restaurants or grocery stores, services like dry cleaning, filling up at a gas station. All of this is accounted for. And not only that, but the model knows that certain types of people spend their money differently. For example, a fast food worker spends their money very differently than a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. The model accounts for all of that as it estimates the total impact that's made on the economy. So as you can see, the sum of those three effects, the direct, indirect, and induced effect, is called the total effect, and that's the number that we're interested in and that our model is trying to gauge.
So Pratt & Whitney itself is a very large company, but it's actually a subsidiary of a larger company called United Technologies Corp., also known as UTC. It's a publicly traded company, and it has 6 subsidiaries, 3 of which are commercial, Otis, Carrier, and UTC Fire and Safety. You might have heard of them. Otis makes elevators, and Carrier makes air conditioning. And then there's also 3 aerospace subsidiaries, with Hamilton Sundstrand, Sikorsky, and, of course, Pratt & Whitney. But we don't want to just look at Pratt & Whitney as a whole, because Pratt & Whitney includes both manufacturing and service divisions. So their engine sales, they produce the engines and they sell them. But they also offer fleet services, which is repairs and maintenance for the engines that they've sold. It's very important to distinguish between these two because the way the analysis goes is that if it's manufacturing, it'll be a lot more capital intensive. So a lot more money will be pushed in that direction, as opposed to fleet services, which requires a lot of labor. So I mentioned earlier that Pratt & Whitney is an MRO provider. MRO is an acronym. The M stands for maintenance. So this is scheduled repairs or scheduled maintenance, regular wear and tear. It's like getting the oil changed in your car. You go in before something goes wrong. And then there's also repair. So when something does go wrong, like a bird flying into the intake, they can repair the engine and get it flying again. But then we also have overhaul, which is a large part of Pratt & Whitney's business, which is where they take an old engine and they completely rebuild it. So this is why you'll see engines on aircraft today that are from the 70s, but they still work great. But each one of these processes requires very specific tools and know-how to perform. So one mechanic can't work on two different aircraft engines. He has to specialize in one, and he has to have the correct tools for that specific engine. So this makes it a very capital-intensive industry.
Now that you know what an MRO operation is, it's important to understand, for the purposes of modeling, how they spend their money. As we mentioned, the idea here is to trace all the transactions that occur as a result of your investment. So in order to be able to do that, you have to understand the patterns that are involved. For an MRO industry, there are two major inputs. The first one are the engine parts. This is something that's that requires a lot of attention for the Columbus operation in particular, because Pratt & Whitney, as Mark said, they design, develop, and manufacture, and then sell the parts and then the engines for the models that they supply to carriers like Delta or to the Air Force. What this means for the maintenance side is that these MRO facilities can buy their parts from within the company. This will give the Columbus facility and other Pratt & Whitney MRO operations a significant cost advantage when compared to their competitors that are independent MRO operators. So there still will be some specialized parts that might come from independent manufacturers, but by getting the bulk of their input in terms of engine parts from within the company, facilities like the one in Columbus have a significant cost advantage by being within that Pratt & Whitney umbrella, by having that engine sales side as well as that MRO side. The second major input for an operation like this is highly specialized labor. A lot of this labor may be obtained locally, so from the Columbus area. You'll have people that are trained mechanics, trained operators, warehouse managers, any kind of labor that requires training can't just be tired off the street, but can be found locally. It also requires trained labor like engineers and managers. A lot of this labor will come from the university system of Georgia. UGA has a fantastic business school and a reputation for producing quality managers, and Georgia Tech's reputation for engineering is among the top in the nation, especially within the Guggenheim School for Aerospace Engineers. So let's put this into context. You remember the image from earlier on when we described the general economic impact analysis model. What we know now is that an MRO operation is highly capital intensive. This means that after you make your investment, you know that as part of the direct effect, a lot of that money is flowing towards the capital side and less so to the labor side. What this means in terms of the model is that you'll have a much higher indirect effect as you trace the money that flows through the suppliers than you will induced effect, because there's less money going towards wages than there is towards capital. It's important to remember throughout this presentation and throughout any models you read that your ultimate goal is to measure the total effect or the final impact made on the economy after this money ripples through. So as we go through each stage, try to imagine where the transaction patterns and other characteristics we identify would fit into this diagram.
So we've talked about Pratt & Whitney and give you a background about economic impact analysis. But now we'll talk specifically about this investment in Columbus, Georgia that Pratt & Whitney made. So in 2011, Pratt & Whitney announced that they'll be investing $19.3 million to upgrade their facility in Columbus, Georgia. This included a building retrofit, as well as upgraded test cells and new tooling for the parts for the new engine they'll be servicing. They advertised that 180 jobs would be created from this at the Pratt & Whitney facility, so that doesn't include the indirect and induced effects. But this also expands their ability, so they can now service the F-117 engine, which is a military engine used on the Globemaster, which is a cargo plane for the United States Air Force. So why would Pratt & Whitney decide to invest in Georgia as opposed to another state? Well, the first thing they had to look at was the labor pool. Georgia has a quick start program that gives specialized training to workers so that they can become mechanics and specialize and get the kind of jobs that Pratt & Whitney needs. We also have, as Chris said, GT engineering, and as well as the rest of the university system that can provide managers and operation specialists. But Georgia is also a right-to-work state. So this means that we don't have to worry about unions. So the labor market can adapt to Pratt & Whitney, or Pratt & Whitney can adapt to the labor market. Next, infrastructure was a huge reason why Pratt & Whitney would want to come to Georgia. Hartsfield-Jackson Airport is one of the largest airports in the world, and being able to be close to their customers, their commercial customers, allows them a significant advantage to other MROs. There's also the Port of Savannah, so whenever they have a large shipment of many aircraft engines from one facility to another, they can take the advantage of economies of scale with large shipping companies. Then we also have one of the biggest reasons, really, is Warner Robins Air Force Base. As I mentioned earlier, the new facility would be able to service the new engine used on aircraft for the Air Force, and being close to Warner Robins gives them a significant advantage over other companies.
So now that we have more of the details of this investment, we can again return to this diagram and kind of see where everything fits in. So your investment that we're starting out with, we now know, is that $19.3 million that Pratt & Whitney spent to expand that Columbus facility to accommodate the F-117 engine. And now you know that as the money flows towards capital, those would be the things like that building refit he talked about, the new tooling and equipment, the upgraded test cell. And then as the suppliers of those, you see the money branch out from them to their suppliers, those would be things like the construction materials for the expansion of the building, the inputs for the different tooling and equipment necessary to operate on the F-117 engine, etc. And you'll see that on the labor side, you'll have not only the personnel required to service the engine, but also people like the construction labor that went in to help expand the facility, and anybody involved in the process of creating the expansion and operating it in its first year. So you can kind of see now how to trace the money all the way from the start, all the way as it ripples out throughout the economy. And again, it's very important that you remember that the ultimate goal here is to capture that whole ripple effect rather than stop too early. Too often, analysts make the mistake of not capturing the entire web of transactions, but stopping after one or two steps. And that severely reduces or can augment the total effect that you estimate of an investment. And if you're making a policy decision, say, about how to bring jobs to the state, you don't want to stop too early on the labor side or the supplier side, or you'll have an estimate that's very wrong. So how do these models work? As we've stressed several times now, it starts with that investment. So for this case, it's that $19.3 million that Pratt & Whitney spent on the expansion. But the problem is now you want to get from that investment amount to some kind of indicator of economic health, whether it's jobs, income levels, output, value added, etc. So what these models do is they use tables called tables of multipliers. Basically, these are factors that scale up your investment amount and convert it from dollars to jobs or dollars to income. And the way they work is it's actually a software program compiles transaction data from the real world that's gathered differently for each industry, each region. It's very, very specific to the kind of operation that you're analyzing. So it knows that for an investment in, say, an aerospace manufacturing firm in the southeast, it identifies how those spending patterns will transition and flow across the region. So for our model, it found in the first run that the multiplier for the jobs was 16.3. What this means is that for every $1 million that Pratt & Whitney invested, they would create 16.3 jobs. And it said that because of this, there would be 315 new jobs coming to the region. We performed the same kind of idea for the total amount of income added. This isn't the same as jobs because obviously people make different amounts depending on the industry they're in, or the job they're performing, etc. So the model found that for this, for the income that would be added due to the investment, for every dollar that Pratt & Whitney invested in the Columbus expansion, there would be $1.05 of income generated. And this translated the $19.3 million investment to a total of about $20 million in new income added to the state. You can kind of see where all this is going. Next, we looked at the value added. This is the difference between your total output and your input prices. So it's the amount of value added to the goods at the Columbus facility due to the investment. The model found that for the $19.3 million that was invested, using a multiplier of $1.70, there would be about $33 million of value added at the Pratt & Whitney site due to the investment. Finally, the biggest multiplier for this model was the $6.10 that was of output that was created for every dollar that Pratt & Whitney invested. So that $19.3 million seemed like a big number to begin with. You can see how it scales up quickly to almost $120 million of additional output. And as you all know, I'm sure, the output is one of the more common indicators of economic health. And so it's important to see exactly how, when the model translates to output, how big that change is. So when the model spits out results, it looks something like this. What's important is that you don't focus necessarily on the total effect numbers, but on the multipliers. These are essentially the backbone of economic impact analysis. These quantify the characteristics you identify in an industry, company, or operation. When you say it's more capital intensive or labor intensive, identify the transaction patterns. These multipliers are the quantification of those qualitative assumptions.
Now we're going to show you the results from 4 different models that we ran to estimate the economic impact from Pratt & Whitney's new investment. The first one assumes that Pratt & Whitney, that this new investment will be in manufacturing. So this assumes that it's very capital intensive and that not quite as much labor intensive. So fewer jobs are created with this model than with other ones. The second model we used was the service industry. Since this facility is an MRO facility, it's more closely related to the service industry. We have specific NAICS codes for this to get the specific service industry for aerospace. But as you can see, the difference between these two, 1,400 jobs were created in the service industry versus 315 if the money were spent as a manufacturer would. So then after this, we had to think, well, does all this money stay in the state? Well, because Pratt & Whitney has so much manufacturing capabilities outside of this state, they buy from themselves a lot and bring it back in. So this means that not all of the money that from that investment stays in the state. So we assume about a 75% local purchase price percentage, which is the amount that stays in. And as you can see, there's almost exactly a 25% decrease across the board. We did this also again for the service industry. We found, again, a 25% decrease.
So what does this all mean? As Mark said, we ran 4 models. The first one was assuming that $19.3 million were invested in an aerospace manufacturing operation. Then we assumed that the $19.3 million was invested in an aerospace service operation. And then we ran each of those 2 scenarios, accounting for the fact that Pratt & Whitney spends a lot of their money outside of the state because they buy from themselves their other manufacturing sites, say, in the western U.S. or in China or in Asia, any other part of the world. So as you can see, the small changes in underlying assumptions created huge variations in the model. In terms of jobs and income, jobs ranged from, in the 200s to almost 1,500. And income ranged from 15 million to about 75 million. What this means for you is if you were to have an analysis done before writing a piece of legislature or making a decision that would impact your constituency, you would want to make sure that whoever ran that model chose the right industry and chose the right amount of money that would stay in the state. If you want to tell your constituency that this $10 million investment would bring, say, 500 jobs, you want to make sure that the researcher didn't make a mistake and it's actually only 50 jobs. And this is all a result of the fact that different industries have different spending patterns and different employment patterns and different wage levels. So it's very important that when you run these models, you identify the correct industry, the correct transaction patterns, and the correct other business characteristics to make sure that your model results are accurate and not just a quick and sloppy job. In terms of value added and output, you can see that the model gave output or value added ranging from 25 to almost $100 million and output ranging from $90 million to almost $150 million. Since these two are very commonly used as indicators of economic health, if you're predicting how say, the GDP of your state or the total value produced or output produced by your state would change due to an investment, misusing a model to predict these kind of numbers can give you very different results as well, especially if you start looking at investments that are larger or pertain to more companies at once. So now that we've told you all the ways that these can go wrong, what can you do about it? The first question to ask whenever you run a model like this is, do my results make sense? And to answer that question, you have to frame it in terms of the industry characteristics, the transaction patterns, and the production intensities of the operation you're looking at. So for us, what this meant was we knew that Pratt & Whitney in general is considered an aerospace manufacturer. But because we were looking at the Columbus operation and the impact on Georgia, we had to identify it as more of a service industry. So that's why we ran the model as manufacturing and then as service, because the operation is a service operation instead of the manufacturing like the parent company is. In terms of transaction patterns, we had to identify the fact that because they're within the Pratt & Whitney umbrella, a lot of the money that they spend on their inputs will be spent outside of Georgia at the other Pratt & Whitney manufacturing sites before the goods are shipped back in. This may not be the case if you're working, say, with small business. You start a new small business, you're going to use mostly local suppliers because you don't have an established supply chain. If you're a larger company like this that does have an established supply chain, you might just add on to that and get more of your inputs from out of state. And then in terms of production intensities, as we mentioned, manufacturing is more highly capital intensive than a service operation, even in an industry like aerospace where there's a high capital intensity in general. So you have to identify all of this stuff before you can make a model that will give you results that are reliable and can be used for decision making. So what we did is we said, well, our 4 models are kind of the extremes that this investment could fall under. So we found the median of the results. And again, you can see the total effect here, but focus on the multipliers. Basically, by creating a new set of multipliers, we modified the industry code that we used to run the model to demonstrate the industry that's actually represented by the Columbus operation in specific. So this may not apply to Pratt & Whitney in general, but we're not interested in that. What we're looking at is the single investment that you want to know how it's going to impact you. So you have to use a set of multipliers that characterize that investment in particular. And this is an area where a lot of analysts go wrong. It's very easy to say, oh, Pratt & Whitney, aerospace, and click the easiest next code. But if you go deeper into it and understand that your operation isn't engine manufacturing, you can almost create your own next code to fit the operation that you're looking at and get a model that's much more accurate. So hopefully by this point, what we've conveyed to you is that it's very important when you read any numbers like this, you need to be an intelligent consumer of the results. And as we've mentioned, a big part of this is carefully analyzing and understanding the industry, company, and operation that you're looking at in terms of the investment that will make the change in your economy. And finally, make sure that you know that very small errors can create huge mistakes in your results. This means that any sloppiness by someone running a model means that the results that they publish, maybe in a newspaper, maybe in a report that crosses your desk, can be very wrong just from a small oversight. So hopefully after seeing all this, you understand how to look at a new investment, understand how that money flows through the economy, and then use that to gut check the levels of the multipliers that they claim will cause this investment to impact your economy differently. So hopefully that gives you an overview of what economic impact analysis is. I know there's a lot of data in that, but if there's anything we can help make clear for you, or you have any questions that pertain to that or branch outside of it, we'd love to give them a shot. Sir? Please.
Good. Okay. Okay, thank you. I have a question. When you were doing the models...
Hold on a second. Try the one next to it. Representative Talton.
Testing. Retesting.
Okay. There you go. You're on.
That was all.
Okay. Thank you. I forgot my question. No, as you go through the models, in this particular case, it is specifically for the aero industry, or in this particular case, for commercial or military use. Did, in fact, you go through the process of looking at the marketing, if, in fact, and I'm using this as a case of military cuts, and that the Air Force would need less engines demand. Did y'all make any scenario test to see how that this market might be affected?
So just to see if I'm understanding the question, what you're saying is when we made the model, did we take into account the fact that a policy decision affecting a possible policy decision affecting, say, the Air Force's budget would change the demand levels? Is that what you're asking? For this analysis, we did not. We basically assumed that the investment amount translated to a certain amount of sales based on the company's existing ratio of net sales to total to plant equipment assets. But that could fairly easily be done. You would just have to quantify exactly how a policy decision would translate to different sales levels, because then those sales levels translate into your model results, your total effect. So it would pretty much add one extra step.
Well, I want to commend you. You've done a great job, fantastic job. But
Thank you.
I was just wondering if, in fact, that through this process you'd looked at different scenarios, how the market might be affected.
No, we had not, but it could easily be done.
Questions? Representative Peake?
Thanks, guys. It's good stuff. My question for you is, can you take this same analysis and apply it to not just an investment in a large plant like Pratt & Whitney, but let's say a high-quality restaurant was coming to to an area. Can you take that same multiplier effect? It works with certain restaurants, I know. Because really, I mean, anytime, whatever the small business is, comes in and puts $4 million in a particular area, the question I have for you is, are you seeing the same multiplier effects from other businesses besides large plant or manufacturing facilities?
Right. So the multiplier changes drastically by industry. So an industry like Pratt & Whitney, in the service side, you have high labor demand. You're going to create a lot of jobs when you invest there. But if you do it in a restaurant, say, it's going to be a lot less capital intensive, so you're not going to spend quite as much out to your suppliers. So you might create more jobs, but it will have less of an income economic impact.
Yeah. But the framework using multipliers will apply no matter what the scale of the investment is. It'll just be that a smaller investment creates a smaller total effect within the same next code. So yes, you could use it to, if you were going to open, I'm assuming, a restaurant, you could use it to see what impact that restaurant would have on the surrounding economy.
I just wanted to add here that another study that I did with another excellent Georgia Tech student 2 years ago, we did an economic impact analysis of the Great Georgia Air Show. And that was a challenge because there were so many volunteers in that. But the Great Georgia Air Show used that study to identify the businesses in the community that were gaining from the air show being put on there, and then was able to go back to those businesses with hard data to say, look, this is what we're contributing to the community. You should contribute back to help us with the air show. So it's a very robust tool that can be used for, and is used by many people for many, many things.
Representative Taylor?
Do you guys ever look like forward 10-year policy decision standpoint from things like sequestration in the defense industry, or from a technology standpoint, you know, the services with the fuel prices as well as the available technology right now are not doing as much blade time on engines and a lot more in simulators. Do you guys look at that from a 10-year out standpoint when you're looking at a model like Pratt & Whitney?
I believe it can be done. The software we use for this program, or for this model, is called M-Plan, and it focuses basically on the first year of operation and construction. There are more advanced and more expensive softwares that do modeling like that account for stochastics and different types of modeling, whether you can predict the demand, whether you can't, etc. The modeling package we had did not, so it doesn't have that long of a planning horizon. But there are modeling packages available that will take your investment and analyze it through its operations over 5-10 years to kind of see how that changes over time with different scenarios.
Representative Pruitt.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, guys. Very great presentation. I think my question is about the same as what Representative Tom Taylor's was. And a lot of times when we make investments, we want to know, is this a 1-year, 5-year, 10-year return on our investment? And so you do not have a timeline, is my understanding. And first off, if it's a real capital intensive project, there's a lot of money being spent up front for equipment. The labor may come a year later or even 18 months or 2 years later. So a timeline model would be very important, I think, to a community that's trying to put together an analysis of how much we put into this and how long is it before we get our return. Mm-hmm. And we're not there yet. Is that my understanding?
Right. In the first year, it takes into account these large initial investments as well as the labor that's added. But in subsequent years, the only real impact comes from the wages paid to labor. So it doesn't include these dynamic effects that other models include further on, which is like growth from more people living in an area. So our model is a little bit more simple.
And to add on to that, the software does have the capability of showing you, say, increases in tax revenue that would come. We didn't demonstrate it here because that wasn't within the scope of what we were looking for, but it can tell you that, it can estimate how much tax revenue is generated, and you can kind of use that to get a net present value for your community, if that's what you're asking. Whether if you're going to offer an incentive to the company and you want to see how long it takes to get the community paid back, is that what your question is?
Well, thank you for the way you put it. Makes perfectly good sense to me. Basically, as the state of Georgia and even local community, what we want to know is if we're going to put this type of investment in to help this project come in, yes, if we now analyze it the way you show it, one could pay back in 2 years, another one could be 15 years, but the numbers are the same, and we need to know which is the best investment. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
That sounds right to me, yes.
I do want to point out that this is a 3-credit course, and that the students' results, it's quite straightforward analytically to take that and present value it out and show what the impact is. And in fact, your Department of Economic Development uses a somewhat simpler economic impact model than these students have used, but in fact does shoot it out, I believe, for 10 years. So it's pretty straightforward to do it. Your Department of Economic Impact, when you're being asked to make decisions about incentives and so on, that is included in the numbers that you are given.
My question was basically, was that a percentage of a project, or was, and if it's not, it couldn't be a fixed percentage, can it?
In terms
I
of,
noticed you said $100 million worth of incentives on this particular project. Now, if, and back to Representative Pruitt's question, you invest in a project with those incentives. That's the money invested by the local community. Do you, if you're figuring that, do you figure if it's a longer term payout? Do you figure a more cost of the incentives to the community, and do you do less incentives? How do you, or is it just a set percentage of a project?
Well, if you look at within plan, we didn't do it, but you can get a tax revenue generated, an estimation. So if you can balance that with the incentives that you offer. The $100 million that was offered was for a different company, ACR. Pratt & Whitney wasn't given any monetary incentives.
and to answer the second part of your question, if you're asking how to gauge how much incentives to offer, is that what you're asking? I think that depends also on, I guess, what you would use as the comparable to your discount rate. If you're going to be if you're going to look at the impact of the investment over, say, 10 years, you have to choose how quickly you want to be repaid versus, if it's in tougher times and you're trying to spur short-term growth, you would maybe incentivize one way. But if you were in, better times and trying to spur long-term growth in your economy, you might be willing to make a bigger investment up front. And it just depends on your framework for your decision more than the actual numbers from the model.
Some of you may recognize me from having been on the Tax Reform Council, so I looked very carefully, we all looked very carefully into the tax incentives being given to attract investment, and that the questions that we would all naturally ask about that analysis is really not done carefully here or in any other state. And I get requests all the time for, do you know of somebody who's doing a more careful job? It's very difficult. Because you're not only looking at what is the company going to produce going forward, but you're looking at things like how much taxes are they going to pay, what are their profits going to be, is that going to put them in a taxable position, and so on. So as an academic, we're constantly working on trying to give you better tools. But one thing that when I go around and talk about this, I have to say about the state of Georgia is that we're very frugal. And the economists who work directly for the state are doing a tremendous job, but we don't have the kind of large analytic study infrastructure that some state legislatures have. Make up some of that with some of your think tanks. But these are questions that I'm convinced, looking at it from a public policy point of view, that you really need to have answered in order to make the best, in the long run, most frugal decisions for the state.
In reference to this particular model, have you also taken into account college and career readiness, that particular community can be able to utilize the same model to estimate on future careers in college, even with our university and technical system?
So is the question, can this model be used to estimate the type of jobs that it will create in a community? Yes, very much so. We didn't show it in this analysis, but an output of the model actually shows the top industries affected and the amount of income or jobs that it will create in each. So if you identify what kind of careers you can train your students in, you can have an idea of how many jobs might be created from a single investment in the local economy by that single expenditure, that single change in the environment. So yes, you can.
And for the class at Georgia Tech, if you'll just hang around, you'll get extra credit. Chairman Knight.
Back to one of your slides. The part where you're looking at the infrastructure and the assets of Georgia, maybe elaborate from a perspective of the legislators in the room as we go, when we start to look at the policy in which this state is viewing, being open for business here. I think there were a couple of points that if you could elaborate on. Obviously you had done some research, but obviously our infrastructure was very important in bringing this company or expanding this company. So what could you elaborate on other companies or industries coming in? And the other thing was the right to work states. You had mentioned that, and if you could elaborate on that, please.
You want to start with infrastructure and I'll finish with labor?
Yeah, so Georgia has a huge infrastructure that can bring pretty much any business wants to come here, because Atlanta, Hartsfield, Jackson is international. So any kind of global business that ever needs a global presence, being close to a large international airport that offers a large number of different routes can be very helpful. We also have the interstate, which I didn't mention earlier. I mean, every state has the interstate, but it's particularly large in Georgia, with I-75 and I-85. There's a lot of traffic, and a lot of people come through the state. It attracts lots of customers.
In terms of your right to work question, the way that my research has shown to interpret this is that when you have non-unionized labor, you can respond with your wage rates fairly quickly to changing market conditions. So if, say, the industry benchmark for a loaded wage rate went from $25 down to $20, if you had to negotiate that with a union, it would take a lot longer to respond, making your inputs a lot more costly in terms of your total production process. But in a state like Georgia, where it's not right to work, it's a lot easier to change wage levels in general when they fluctuate in the market. So companies that work in states that are not right to work and do deal with unions, a lot of times that can be a several month or even year-long process before you can make the smallest changes in wages or working conditions. And I'm sure some of you have found that in your respective industries. So that's a big pull. I know in parts of Pratt & Whitney's model I've read online that they do operate in right-to-work states or not right-to-work states. So coming down here, this is a positive change for them.
Thank you.
And let me just say, it's probably obvious to all that I love my job, not the grading, but having taught this class over several years has been fascinating, because the students each semester are coming in talking about what business came into Georgia recently. And so I get to see, as I watch this year after year, the patterns that develop, and I can sort of see that this business, for instance, this semester, we've got a couple students, they're starting to look at projects. And there are some businesses that have been brought in because of the Caterpillar tractor investment. Okay, so I'm in the position where I can see this as a rolling effect and can start to see agglomerations form and almost begin to predict where would be a good place for us to go out and recruit. The other thing is that through the tax reform, and I'm still working very much on tax reform, believe in it very strongly, pro-growth. Through the tax reform, I've had the opportunity to talk to numbers of companies who either want to expand or who are thinking of coming here. Number one thing they say, quick start. Number one, almost, I would say every single one of them. The number two thing they'll say is the right to work state, because they have flexibility. And they can go there, and I think that's where the flexibility, we fall a little bit behind Texas on that. Texas gives more of a flavor of you can really, do more, be flexible, be more entrepreneurial in Texas maybe than you can here. And I think the third thing about incentives, I don't know of evidence, I think it would be very hard to collect, that incentives actually make a difference. What I think, and this is personal opinion, what I think is happening is that the system by which we give incentives brings together people that can make it happen. So we had a project that was at the Port of Savannah, and one of the companies needed a big, huge crane that they were only going to use 25% of the time, very expensive. And our people in the Department of Economic Development were able to find other people who could use that crane, put together a deal so we could afford the crane. And it's just because we're sort of a small enough, maybe frugal enough state that the right people are talking to each other. And so I think that what we call incentives, really, you need to think more broadly that we are really good, as I see it, and I work all over the world and all over the country, right? As I see it, we are really good at finding ways to make things happen for companies. So I guess I would put that kind of broadly up under incentives as one of the reasons. But again, first thing people say, quick start. Second thing, right to work.
Thank you, Chairman. Two questions. I guess, Doctor, you somewhat answered the question I was about to ask. Is there a model out there that takes into consideration the synergy that's developed, and without picking a company out, we have a solar company that started up, that actually started out of the incubator tech. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And they located in Norcross, and they're building things out there. And is there something that takes into account that they're there and they start building these types of panels, so the folks that want to get close to that technology then come there, and then more people come? Is there a model that goes that far ahead? And the second question, and you can answer them both, is it not true that sort of administrative offices can move around, but when you get an investment like a Kia, like a Caterpillar, that's much more, with that capital investment like the gentleman spoke of, when you sink that kind of capital in the ground, you're much more likely to be anchored to a community as long as the working conditions stay in place, and therefore it could lead to a housing market. It might be 10, 15 years down the road. Can you give us, some ideas of how this fit in economically in terms of quick payback incentives versus the longer term?
Okay, a couple things. One is behind this in-plan model is actual data of actual transactions of companies that bought and sold things. They update it every year. There's a tremendous amount of data there. So I think this is an example of what we're calling big data. And what this team has done, and what Georgia Tech is particularly keyed up to be able to do, is to think about things. And also, Chris is doing an independent study with me this semester looking at this question, is how can we effectively take these big data ideas and collapse them down into a usable model that can not only give you answers, but that you can simulate and play with. And I know that the concern about the sequester and so on is a huge one for Georgia, and you would just actually run the model backwards to make your projections on that. But the in-plan type model is a limited form of model. It uses multipliers. There are modelers that I work with who would never speak to me again if they knew the word multiplier came out of my mouth, because they think it's too limited. So there's another class of models called general equilibrium models that takes into account all those effects. But I think what these students have shown, and I think what's really important, there is no substitute for getting in and looking at the particular situation. You find the best model, and then you're just going to have to dig in and understand it and make the adjustments that need to be made. And by the way, there's nothing so good as a degree in economics to set you up to do that analysis and work with the models. But everything that I've heard everybody here ask can be done. I will say one other thing. I'm working on a project that I've been talking with Larry O'Neill about, which is to use, and with individuals from, colleagues from the University of Georgia and Georgia State, where we can use a general equilibrium model and answer some of these specific questions more broadly for the state of Georgia, and specifically to give you a tool that you can use to analyze the effect of federal government decisions on the state of Georgia on tax revenues and so on. But it's a much bigger job, and we're doing that. They've got 5 other states who are interested in having that done. What's the impact of federal decisions on the state economy? So that's a project that we're pushing forward, and today's meeting has just made me much more aware of the need for this model.
Representative Braddock.
And sir, to add to that question that was just answered, I believe you asked about Caterpillar and Kia, and we're talking about how the inputs could affect how the economy changes over time. One thing we didn't mention today that we have talked about is a concept of agglomeration, where a big plant like that is going to have a huge network of suppliers it does need. And the in-plan model will tell you exactly where that money is spent in terms of capital. So it won't tell you the exact how suppliers might move, but it will tell you where the money is being spent. So you can get an idea of which industries might move to Georgia to be closer to a major supplier. So I know we've seen with Kia, they're manufacturers of exhaust systems and other auto industry manufacturers that are moving to Georgia to be suppliers for that Kia plant. And the in-plan analysis for the Kia plant itself would have told you that a lot of money is being spent on those kind of parts and gauge kind of how much demand there is in the area and how that might impact the decision of a supplier to move down here, down to Georgia.
Representative Taylor. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Can y'all hear me?
I'm sorry. Representative Braddock.
About tax incentives and how that impacts our ability to attract jobs as a state. And one of the questions I have is, in looking at our tier system, it looks like Georgia's competing against Georgia versus us competing as a region and globally. And is there any analysis that you guys have been able to pull or can do that would look at what opportunities we're losing because of our tier system? Because from what I'm hearing from like our economic development folks is they'll pick, you know, 2 or 3 areas, and because of the tier, like they'll pick a tier 1 county and then it doesn't have what they're looking for, so they'll, you know, eliminate Georgia and go to another state where there are other areas of Georgia that they would have otherwise looked at had it not been for the tier system. Have y'all done any analysis on the impact of that to our state, or can you?
It can be done. I think that in general these studies would suggest that what you're saying is exactly right. You have states, counties competing against counties, states competing against states, and we're driving down the effect so that basically all those incentives are basically going to the companies. And that's just kind of a general academic view. But I think in this case, you really have to look at that particular situation. I'm a free market economist, and I would rather go to the counties that may be losing the business and say, let's see what you can do. Let's see if we can find a way to help you get this, or maybe there's a more appropriate business for you that's a spinoff. So you can use this study to look for spinoffs that would make sense for a particular county. But just as a free market economist, I would, rather than try to take a hatchet to it with some legislative benchmarks, identify what's going on in the natural flow of the economy and go in and really provide the support there. Duly noted. If we're going to close, I'll make just one last comment. So often the things that Georgia Tech does and is known for are really, it's not so clear how to bring them down and apply them to immediate situation. And maybe that's part of the reason that Georgia Tech hasn't been as well representative as it might have been here in the state capitol. I will say when I was put on the Tax Reform Commission, President Peterson called me into his office, and he told me how personally anxious he was that we could find ways for Georgia Tech to be more helpful to you all and to the state. And through my experience with the Tax Reform Council and all of those hearings we did around the state, I personally am just excited about the state and anxious to help. And so I just want to say to any of you who want to follow up on this, please leave me your card or contact me. I'm on the school website. I have my own website. We are, and the university, the institute as a whole really wants to back up and do what we can to help you and to help the state of Georgia's legislators and business people. And please do take me up on that, and we'll get you the help that you need on this. It's exciting and some real possibilities there. The last thing I just wanted to share a personal vignette with you. So in this class, the semester before last, there was a student, really beautiful woman, tall track star, and she had kind of been grumpy about the class, So we get to the end of it, and she did a really great project, and we get to the end, and she comes in one day, and she just glares at me, and she said, well, you've ruined me. And I said, oh, what did I do now, you know? And she said, well, I'm walking across campus, and I see some tire tracks in the mud. And I stopped there, and I'm thinking, I wonder what company made that tractor. Where did it come from? Did it come from Japan? What kind of tractor is it? What kind of engine is in that tractor? And she said, I realized that you had totally destroyed my life. and I felt like I had gotten the world's biggest Christmas present, because that is exactly what I wanted to do and exactly what economics can do. And so just in general, thank you all for supporting the university system and giving me the opportunity to have this much fun. And do let us help.
As we close out, before you... Pretty amazing. I want to ask one question, and I don't want to put you on the spot on the one hand and I do on the other. You've done and A.D. Frazier and those others that were on the tax council did a lot of work. You've got a lot of legislators here. Is there something that that came out of the tax council that we have not enacted, and there's a lot of it, that you have a personal, that you think would do the state the most good as far as economic development goes?
Well, I worked personally and particularly on the mining, manufacturing, and agriculture piece. And it's not sexy, which is probably why I got through. You know, I've told the story, I'll tell it again, of we were in Dalton, and a woman, sole proprietor, testified. There were the Shaw carpet people that were all there in their suits, and she comes afterwards and she gives her testimony. So I went up to her afterwards and I said, thank you so much, it must have been really difficult to do. Tell me about your situation. And she said, well, I'm a sole proprietor, and I go around in Florida and South Carolina, and I get plants and I bring them to Atlanta and I put them in hotels. And it's like called interior design or something. I said, well, what's tax situation for Georgia like for you? She says, oh my Lord, she says, I have 17 different forms I have to get from various branches of the state of government. And I have to keep those get them every year and keep them updated with all of my suppliers in order to get the tax consequences. This is one woman, right? And I looked, I said, well, that didn't make any sense. What you passed last session that modernized and streamlined those regulations that had been building since 1936, that woman is now going to be able to carry around one laminated card in her billfold. It gives me shivers. But I'm saying that I don't even know I wish I could measure the impact of that on the state economy, and especially on small businesses. I can't, but I know it's huge. So that was sort of my personal favorite. And the other, and again, just working to try to prove this all the time. Now I'll tell you another story. When we were on the tax council, we had one session that had all the high-tech guys and all the venture capitalists, and they were all standing around talking. So I went and listened to them, and we got to get income tax rates down to 0. And you know, and I'm thinking, there's just no way we can do that anytime soon. We just can't, you know. And then I did what you sort of do, is you say, well, if it's 6 and they want 0, let's split the difference. So I said, well, what about 3%? Which don't anybody tell A.D. Frazier I did this. But well, what about 3%? What would that do? Well, they just started gleaming, and they said that would do it. That if you talk about property tax rates and all the other things that companies think of when they come to the state, if we went from 6% to 3%, we could compete with Texas. We could compete with Tennessee. We could compete with Florida, because it's within spitting distance. So for me, I would do what it takes. Like I sometimes say about you folks, not to you, gee, I wish they would make me queen and just do what I say. But if I were queen, I would just take that income tax rate and lower it to 3%. And promise you that the results would be absolutely fantastic. So I would urge, constantly urging, and I do a lot of work to try to get us focused back again on getting that income tax rate down.
Thank you. Chairman Chanel. Nothing? Chairman Knight. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been probably one of the most, since I've been up and on the chairmanship side, this is probably one of the most informative meetings I think I've ever heard. We only hear the side of the fiscal note. We never hear the side of the economic development piece, and I just want to thank you. You want to give them another hand?
Thanks, thanks for inviting us to come speak with you. It was an honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're adjourned.